Thanks for joining us today. I am here with a dear friend of mine, someone I consider a mentor, somebody if I was asked who has had some of the most influence on my life, his name would be right up there near the top. You're joining us, so in some sense he needs no recognition, but we're here today with Dr. J.P. Moreland, who's a professor emeritus at Biola University, Talbot School of Theology, has been recognized as one of the most influential philosophers today, as a friend of mine, but also a colleague now at Biola, which is one of my great privileges. JP, thanks for carving out time and for joining us.
Well, it's a joy. It's always great to be with colleagues, and we're so happy to have you on the faculty. By the way, a professor emeritus is retired, and I'm a distinguished professor.
Oh.
But I don't want people to think that I've retired. So unless you're trying to give me a message of some kind.
Well, I wasn't going to say it, but now I'm playing. Thanks for the gracious correction. We want you around as long as we can have you.
Thank you.
Well, the good news, we got a bunch of questions of people lining up here. So here's how we're going to do this. I've had some people email me and text me and TikTok me questions for you. I've got about 2 or 3, maybe 4 to get us going. And then we're just going to go live and take the questions that are in the chat box right here on a range of issues. So you could ask JP on science, on philosophy, which is his expertise, on the historical Jesus, ethical issues, and we will let him respond to it. But I also want to give you a chance, JP. You've really poured your life into Biola and Talbot and really believe in the philosophy and apologetics program. So I want to give you a chance, as throughout this conversation, really to weigh into that. But let me jump in and ask you, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I had a chance to interview you about evidence for the soul. And one of the arguments you made is that while our body changes over time, that's not sufficient to ground identity. There must be something immaterial, and namely the soul. Somebody responded and said, well, wait a minute. As I understand it, in the brain, there are certain particles that actually don't change through one's life. Maybe they would be sufficient to ground personal identity over time. Your response?
Well, first of all, that would mean that I'm the same thing as a group, namely a group of cells. But I know that I'm not a group. I'm a single thing. So I can't be a cluster of those cells that remain the same. Because I'm a single thing. I'm not a collection of things. That would be the first thing I'd say. Like a collection might be a pile of sand or a table that's got a whole bunch of parts to it. The second thing I would say would be that if you took a table and didn't change any of its parts, but you smashed it so that one leg was sticking up in the air, another one was down, and the other 2 were laying out flat, it wouldn't be a table any longer, even though it would be made of the same parts, because it wouldn't have the same structure. So to have the same table, you have to have the same parts and the same structure. Now, even if the cells do remain the same, they're in motion. They do change relative to one another. We know that from what's called neuroplasticity, which is just the idea that your brain structure isn't fixed. It is like a plastic. It's pliable. And so the neurons in the brain and the various cells are constantly changing their structure and wiring together with certain neurons and other neurons. So you still have a flux, maybe not of those parts, but of the structure that they are in. And that's enough for them not to be the same collected whole, because the structure of that collected whole would change. And then finally, those cells are made up of billions of little subatomic particles. Neutrons, electrons, quarks, whatever's down there, turtles, and these things are constantly in motion. They're moving. Sometimes they fly away and return, and so it's a bloomin' buzzin' confusion down there. And so it's actually not the case that those cells remain the same, even if they stay in there, because they're really different because of the motion and the kind of replacement of some of the subatomic particles.
That's a great response. So even if there were some of the identical particles, the arrangement and the construction itself changes, which means it's not sufficient to ground identity over time in the way that a soul would be.
That's exactly right.
That's a great response. Let me ask you one more, and we're kind of diving into these tough questions. A question I get often asked is, do people who commit suicide lose their salvation? So is committing suicide inconsistent with somebody being a follower of Jesus and ultimately going to heaven?
Yes. I'm one of those that believes in something called eternal security. And that means that if you are genuinely regenerated and born again and in the kingdom, then you can't lose your salvation. Just like a person who gets older can't be unborn in their family. You cannot have a good relationship with the family. You can lose rewards, but you can't lose your salvation. And so there's no doubt in my mind that suicide is a tragedy. It is a great sadness to God, and it's actually a very selfish act, though understandable, because I understand life getting so painful that one would rather just not feel the pain. But it's still not the right thing to do, and but yet it is covered by the grace of Christ and the cross, just like anything else we do. And so suicide in no way is different than any other significant sin, like murder or anything else, that it doesn't matter if it happened at the very last instant of your life on earth, because you've already had all your sins forgiven, past, present, and future. So you might lose some rewards, but we all lose rewards for various things we do. But I'm convinced that those people continue to have eternal life, which is a quality of life, but it's also an ever-ending kind of life, and that's what we have, eternal life.
That's a great answer that I can imagine would be very comforting for people as well. So
Absolutely.
Let me follow up on this then. I see a question from Aiden Peterson related to the soul. And then those of you who just chimed in, put your questions in here and we will go to a range of questions to Dr. Moreland. So if somebody can't lose their salvation, does that mean somebody who, say, apostatizes or who said they were once a believer never truly had salvation in your theology?
Right. That's a real tough one. I would say that if a person does that, it is still possible that they genuinely became a believer and fell away. But if a person does do that, I would say two things. First, number one, that means to me it's highly likely that the person never was born again in the first place, because there are certain signs that are to take place, and it may very well be, and I would bet that it's highly likely they weren't saved. On the other hand, if they were still saved, nobody would have any evidence for believing that, because a person could say, well, I can remember praying the prayer to trust Christ. All right, and you probably sensed that you were sincere in doing that. But this provides overriding counter evidence that you weren't sincere. And so now you're having to pit the weight of my sense of my own sincerity when I prayed against the weight of me not just backsliding, whatever that means, but apostatizing and turning into an atheist who's hostile to the faith. That is really big time stuff. And so that would lead me to believe that even if I were still saved, and usually it's probably not the case, still, I think I would have no grounds for thinking that I am. And I should be very, very, very concerned and cautious if a person were I.
Is it fair to sum up and say, in your position, somebody can't lose their salvation by some egregious sin? And if somebody falls away, chances are they weren't in the faith, but you're open to the logical possibility that somebody consciously chooses to walk away and reject the faith. Did that encapsulate your view?
That's exactly right.
Okay, good. Let's go to Aiden Peterson here. He says, what implications does BCI, brain-computer interface research, have for the existence of the immaterial soul? These are things in which your thoughts can perform actions through devices. So I think he means you think a certain thing and it controls a hand or a foot. What does that mean for the existence of the soul when it seems to be triggered physically?
Well, it has no implications at all, because you have to remember, it's one thing to ask, what is a conscious state? What is a feeling of pain or a thought? It's another thing to ask, what is it that triggers one or causes one to happen? Those are completely different questions. So let's grant, for the sake of argument, that thoughts are not physical, that they're immaterial. Could make a case for that, but let's grant it. What causes a thought? Oh, gee. Seeing something, having a bad traumatic experience triggered. A brain event could cause a thought. If I get stuck with a pin, that will cause a thought that this hurts. I can cause a thought because I can freely sometimes redirect when so all kinds of things can cause a thought, and a thought can cause all kinds of things. And so, without these devices, my thoughts, along with my will, are correlated and tied to very specific neurological pathways, and I am able to raise my arm by willing to do so. And that's not willy-nilly. I mean, I don't will to raise my arm and my toe wiggles. The point is that the different states of consciousness, my thoughts, and my intention, like I'm intending to look at that or to think about that, those cause body movements, right? Specific ones. Now, I don't know why a scientist could not, because remember, it probably does that by causing something to occur in the brain. Suppose I thought of something, it was a brain event, which would then run down a certain neural pathway to a muscle and cause it to move. Does that make sense to you? Okay, so I don't know why I couldn't have a thought, and a scientist would be able to record what brain event took place and then ask me, what was the thought that you had just then? And then try and find a way to hook up that brain event with a computer so that a word appears on the screen or something like that, as opposed to my hand moving up or writing the letter A. So you still have the problem that in order to create those devices, you have to come up with a list of correlations between thoughts and brain states. And to get those, the scientists can measure the brain states, but they don't have any idea what the thought is unless they ask the person himself or herself, because conscious states are not physical and they're privately accessible. I alone have direct access to my own conscious states, thank God, and nobody else does. And so I would just say it's no different than the way we move our bodies, with a brain state being caused by a thought that then moves a body now, but it's being connected over repeated correlation. Scientists are able to rewire it to a computer terminal, let's say.
That's really helpful. So the way we function now, a thought shapes our actions. Just because we added another medium that's physical wouldn't change the beginning cause being thoughts that put behaviors and physical things into practice. It doesn't change the nature of it and the distinction between thought and between a reaction physically.
And that's why these experiments don't really matter. I mean, in that sense. So they're so particular.
That's great. For those of you listening, if you want to explore this a little bit more, I had a chance to interview Dr. Moreland just a few weeks ago on the question of the existence of the soul, and he really unpacks it there. So scroll down the videos, and you'll find it. One of the next questions comes from Carmen Friesen, and it's about reconciling the Old Testament God with the New Testament God. The Old Testament God in this question was smite and destruction. New Testament God loves peace and mercy. How would you respond to that?
Well, Jesus was more vicious than the Old Testament God because he condemned people to hell, and he actually talked more about hell than he did heaven. Now, it's one thing to command the annihilation of a group of people like the Canaanites who were so evil that they most likely deserved it. It's another thing to sentence somebody to hell for eternity. I don't know, which do you think is a heavier? Well, so Jesus, who is an exact representation of we'll say the New Testament God, was pretty harsh in certain ways, and conversely, the Old Testament God was merciful and loving and kind. And so I think this has been overstated by people. People have overstated the severity of the Old Testament God and the loving mercifulness of the New Testament God when you find both in both. And so here's the final thing I would say. When Jesus began the Sermon on the Mount, which if you look carefully, that is meant by Matthew to be parallel to Moses giving the law of Moses, because both of them go to Egypt in their childhood. They both come back out of Egypt. One delivers the Mosaic law. The other delivers the Sermon on the Mount. Israel goes down to Egypt and comes out. So there's a parallel being made here. Now, Jesus has an opportunity in the Sermon on the Mount to set the course for his kingdom and the way he's going to preach and teach. The very first thing he does is to affirm everything that was taught in the Old Testament. He said there won't be a jot or a tittle of the Old Testament that will be changed until it's all been fulfilled. Now, a jot and a tittle is just a little squiggle. It's not very big. You can hardly see what he's meaning is every word of the Old Testament is God's very word, and he embraced the God of the Old Testament and believed in the Old Testament. And so if Jesus accepted the God of the Old Testament, but we're having trouble with that God, the problem is probably on our side in our moral intuitions, or maybe a misunderstanding of certain passages. So I would say we go back to the drawing board and maybe re-examine us rather than trying to shape what the Old Testament really means. And then in 20 years, that'll be out of date too,
That's a great word. I especially love what you said about we see both in both Testaments. In the Old Testament, we do see God's judgment unmistakably. But Ezekiel 18:23, God said he's rather have us turn from our wickedness and repent. In the New Testament, we see God's love, but we also see his justice. That's a great response. Now, I have a question here from True Counterphobia about sanctification. But first, JP, I want to ask you, there's a lot of things you could have done being a speaker, being a writer, you've been a pastor, but you have committed your life at Biola teaching philosophy and apologetics. I'm curious, why did you take that route in terms of impact? And why have you stayed at Biola for so long when you've had opportunities at more well-known secular universities?
Well, Sean, being at Biola for 30 years now has given me the opportunity to accomplish things in equipping and training people that I couldn't have done in any other ministry. Now, I could have written and done things, but being at a university, I'm able to team up with other scholars and other professors, and the synergy is just tremendous. And as a result, I have been able to see a generation of younger brothers and sisters be mobilized and equipped in a way that I could not have done anywhere else. Now, why Biola? Well, please understand, I've never been a salesman, and I'm just being straight. Biola is the only school in the country, in my view, that combines absolute academic excellence and rigor, as is recognized increasingly by the secular community, with a tender, loving heart for the Lord Jesus, a desire to fulfill the Great Commission, and a hunger to disciple and form believers to be like Jesus. And I think those are both on an equal footing there. So in the apologetics program, of which I'm privileged to teach sometimes, and in our program, we've been able to do that. There's nothing like these programs anywhere in the United States. I'm sad to say. I mean, I wish there would be 20 of them immediately, pop up. We need so many more, but at least we have a place here where we can have students come and take classes online and in other ways, and they can get some real serious equipping and training that'll help them in their own faith, and then help them to know how to share with others.
The fact that you've been at Biola for so long has enabled you to influence so many generations rather than skipping around. And I'm one of those you've influenced, as you know. So thanks. Thanks for that. Let me jump to this question. Those of you throwing questions in, I'm going to do my best to get to as many as I can. True Counterphobia says, why do we still sin? What purpose does God have for the Christian sinning? I've tried to get answers to find the only answer I get is sanctification, and that's not satisfying.
Well, I'm not sure what the question is, but I'll just take a stab at it. If the question is, why do we still sin? It's because we're in a period of time where we have a fallen nature. There is what's called the world, which is organized flesh, and there are genuinely demons that exist. They're not make believe, and so we're subjected to our own weakness, and we sin because we're fallen, broken beings, and so that's why we still sin. Now, why would God set up a situation where that was possible? I think the answer is that God set up a world where He did not desire the fall to take place, but He knew that it would, but He didn't cause it. Adam had the power not to sin, and Adam and Eve could have not fallen. God, knowing but not causing the fall, was willing to do that because there was at least some good that could be redeemed that would make it worth it letting it happen. And the best situation would have been if there had never been any fall. But at least, given free will, which is a high value to God, hell is actually a monument to how much He prizes freedom of the will and autonomy. It really is. That I believe this life is a place where, number one, we actually get the chance to affect each other. We really do. And that effect can be positive or negative. And so I'm glad that we do, but that brings along with it the possibility that we do it negatively. I think the other thing is that some goods are possible, given that there is sin. For example, in a perfect world, it would not be possible to exhibit the value of showing compassion to someone in deep need or exhibiting strong courage in the face of evil. So there are some virtues that can only be cultivated in a world like this one. And so that is a positive thing that came out of it as well. So I think that in the long run, God will eventually set up a situation when there's a new heaven and new earth, or when we go to heaven, Sean, where what our brother, I believe he's a guy, our brother here would, a situation where that will be no longer there. But guess what? It will be a situation where we have had a lifetime of wanting to go there, or not wanting to go there. And it wasn't forced upon us prematurely, but rather it was this incubation period gave us a chance to really think this through and make it an informed decision.
That's a great response. True Counterphobia also follows up and says, who has more books in the background? And given that you have two doors, I'm pretty sure I have you 2-1 on this one.
I believe you do. I've given a lot of mine away because I memorized them.
Oh, nice. Excellent. I love it. I actually would believe that. Okay, here's a couple that are right up your alley, and these are the very things we talk about in the apologetics and the philosophy program. So it could be that a couple of these are our students or prospective students. One says, Dr. Moreland, what are the strongest scientific research pieces that support the veracity of near-death experiences?
Oh, my. There are anywhere from 200 to 300 million of these worldwide. In the United States, in the last several decades, 3 or 4 decades, there have been 14 million of them in the U.S. That's 1 out of every 25 people. The same statistic in Germany, by the way. And so these are so widespread that you can't dismiss them out of hand. Now, there are a whole host of reasons why it is beyond reasonable doubt that these are real. But I'll give you the most important reason. It's called evidential near-death experiences. And these are cases where a person is clinically dead and they gain information while they were clinically dead that it was impossible for them to gain if they just had oxygen deprivation to the brain or the brain underwent some sort of a shutdown and was revived. Because there are reports of people hearing conversations on other floors of the hospital. One woman saw her brother and her daughter in the cafeteria of the hospital getting ready to come and see her, and she had died. They did not know that. And to tell you the honest truth, the daughter was wearing a dress that this woman did not like, and she said to herself, why in the world did she wear that dress? She knows I don't like it. And then her brother, the uncle of her daughter, I kid you not, was complaining that, Sarah would have to get sick and be close to dying today. I had a golf game scheduled. And so when they came in the room, she confronted him about the nurse heard this, about what he was saying in the cafeteria. And by the way, she revived before they came in there, and she told her what kind of dress her daughter was wearing. And this is now verified. I mean, and I could go on and on. One person, they did a controlled study in the Netherlands. One of the Netherlands' top cardiologists, Pim van Lommel, did a study where they compared resuscitation patients that did not report near-death experiences with a sample of those who did report near-death experiences when they had cardiac arrests. And the people who did not report near-death experiences, they were both asked to describe what procedures were done to them when they were out. And they were all over the map. They tended to describe things they'd seen on TV. The other group, by contrast, was incredibly accurate. They didn't describe things that were done on TV because it's not done that way. And there was one guy that was so accurate that Pim van Lommel said they could use the taped interview of him to train new physicians about what to do with a cardiac arrest. This is a documented study, and I believe it may have been published in the journal The Lancet, but I'm not sure about that. Okay. So there's a ton of evidence that people coming to know things that they couldn't have known if this were just naturalistically explainable.
This is really the point that persuaded me, is that it's not just somebody coming back with a story, but having information that they could not have gained naturally in the physical brain dead or not heart beating state that points towards an immaterial reality after death. Now,
and that information has been verified by
and verified.
like in the medical staff, nurses, things like that. Yes, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, no. So very quickly, give us one book that you would refer those to who want to read further and find the documented sources.
I think that the most interesting book would be Imagine Heaven by John Burke. I know John, he researched this incredibly. I think a pretty good read that is really emphasizes evidence and answering objections would be the book on evidence of the afterlife. The guy's name escapes me. He came to Biola. I talked to him. Evidence of the afterlife. Okay. Yeah.
That's great. So, people can Google it now easily. That's a wonderful, wonderful answer. Now you're looking for it. It's okay. Someone will find it and throw it in the comment section. By the way, if you're enjoying this, give us a thumbs up along the way. We've got a lot more questions here for
Jeffrey Long is his name. Jeffrey Long.
Jeffrey Long. Okay, excellent.
Yeah. Hey, let me answer a question that goes back to our phobic friend or claustrophobic guy or whatever. Okay. And it's about will we sin in heaven? And do you mind if I just try to give a word on that? Yeah.
Please do.
My answer is that we will not sin in heaven. Will we be able to sin in heaven? I think we will. I think we will be able to sin in heaven. Well, then why won't we? And how do I know that we won't? Well, let's do the first question. Why won't we? I'm 72 years old, and I got about 5 years of age. My parents started letting me go out in the front yard and maybe play with my trucks and things like that. So from 5 until now, 67 years, I have had the opportunity every single day of my life to go out and find a hot, teeming pile of dog poop that's fresh and steaming and wet, and just get on my hands and knees and chow down on it. Now, I was free to do that, but I never did it, and I never will do it because it is utterly uninteresting to me. It's actually disgusting. When people are in heaven, and if you read some of these near-death experiences and see what it's like, people are overwhelmed with just the beauty of goodness, and they're drawn to it. And sin it would be like chowing down on dog poop. I mean, it's so ugly and boring and disgusting, and that people won't even be the least bit interested in it. We think, oh my gosh, it's still going to be, no. From their perspective, that's over with, and nobody in their right mind would do that. How do I know that that's true? Because the word says that heaven will be that way, and I believe that God in his foreknowledge knew that would be the case, and he's revealed it to us. So I trust his revelation that there will not be sin, but then I have an explanation for why, given the disgusting nature of it when we see it from that perspective.
It is interesting that Paul says we see through a glass darkly now, but when we get to heaven, we'll have clarity of even the smallest sins, how terrible they are, and our inner nature is changed. There's no outer temptation, so the capacity is there, but we know it won't happen.
Absolutely. Exactly.
That's a great answer. Scott Hudson has an excellent question here. I'm doing my best to get to these, friends. He says, what is your view on abstract objects, and what are your thoughts on William Lane Craig's position on them as being useful fictions?
I do not think you can make sense out of reality if you don't believe in some abstract objects. Now, an abstract object is some real entity that is not in space and time, but is outside of space and time. And God would be abstract in that sense, at least without the created world. And so I believe that truth is an abstract object. I mean, what sense does it make to say, how many inches long is truth? Or where is it located? Is it in Brazil or somewhere else? So Yeah, I think properties are abstract objects, and I think that God's own attributes are things he found himself with. He did not create those. He's kind of, quote, stuck with omnipotence and all those things, in a sense. Now, I think all the other abstract objects, which I limit to properties and relations like larger than, God creates them in the sense of sustaining them in existence. They never came to be because they're outside space and time, and coming to be would be a temporal event. So they do not come to be or perish, but there is another way that God creates, and that's by sustaining an existence. And I believe that sense is he sustains these other universals. I think Bill, I just rather would not go there because he's a very, very dear friend of mine. We have a difference on this thing, and I just think that we're just going to have to agree to disagree on that particular topic.
And I know he would feel exactly the same. And I think it's important for people to see that on some essentials, Christians cannot differ and call themselves followers of Jesus.
Of course.
But on these important issues, we can differ and have charity with one another. And so I think that's great. Yes. That kind of brings us to our next question from Indy de la Torre. Says, false preachers are getting clever on how to devise people, and it is hard to make a distinction. What are the keys to distinguishing between a cult and true gospel teachings?
The first thing you need to do is to get clear on the difference between a theological cult and a sociological cult. Now, a sociological cult can have orthodox teaching. Such a cult is where there is a dominant leader and the community is extremely ingrown, and they kind of lose their own wills, and they do whatever the leader tells them, and so there is a certain kind of social structure that's cultish. That could happen in an Orthodox people who believe the true gospel. I hope it doesn't. Now, the relationship between a sociological cult and the true gospel, there really isn't much of one, except we would hope that people who embrace the true gospel would know better than to get into that kind of behavior. Now, if you're talking about a cult that is a theological cult, which is the real problem, that means that they hold false views on things at the very core of the Christian religion, not marginal things that, we can differ and still be in the family. But these are things, and they will almost always zero in on two things. The first is the deity of Christ and the Trinity. They will reject the deity of Christ. And the second is that they will reject the gospel of justification by faith through grace. And they will always add works. Jesus died for us, plus thus and so. And so if that's usually the two key signs of how to spot a theological cult is the rejection of the deity of Christ and a gospel of works.
That's a really helpful distinction between the sociological practice of a church or a group and theologically what they believe. And both can be unhealthy if not practiced correctly. That's a great distinction. Here's one for you that I actually wanted to ask you myself. Keith Wilson says, is gender rooted in the soul? Is there such a thing as a person without a gender, ID, a gender?
It's a tough one, and I'm maybe 60-40 on my answer. So I'm not 90-10. I'm about 60% sure I'm right on this one. So take it for what it's worth. I do believe that gender is ultimately rooted in the soul because I take gender to be fundamentally an expression of a person's biology. Now, gender is more than biology, but it was created to be a fuller way of living in the world, consistent with your biological sex. And since I believe that the soul is what forms the body, then if a female body is formed, there must be a female soul to form that body. What that would mean then would be that everyone would have a gender in the sense of a natural, an expression of their biological sexuality that was the natural one that they should express. Now that can be, for a whole variety of reasons, confused. I don't think that confusion means that their gender really is different, but they may feel a different gender.
Okay.
You think that there are people born hermaphrodites and that seem to have organs of both sex? And I'll be candid and say I really don't know quite what to do with those cases. If I were a betting person, I would probably bet on the fact that there is a leaning, that there is a more of a maleness or femaleness. So it's probably a male with some female features or a female with some male features. But I'm not an expert on that, but that would be my guess.
That's a great response, and I want to highlight for those viewing that you've thought about this a ton. Deeply influential philosopher, but you don't show certainty in some things that you believe. You're willing to say I'm 60-40, and this is something I really believe. I learned from you at Biola when I first took that apologetics class. You said we kind of rate our beliefs. If you believe something, you're 51-49, but you can grow when those convictions and beliefs over time. How helpful is that for people who are doubting?
Oh, it's huge. It's huge because people who doubt feel shame, and they shouldn't feel shame. There's nothing wrong. There's no sinfulness about doubting. That's different than unbelief. Unbelief is an act of the will where you set yourself against believing. Doubt is where you desire to believe, but you can't bring yourself because you have an unresolved problem of some kind. If you could get it resolved, you'd like that. So that's the sign there. And I think the doubt is just a part of growing. So for me, here's the important payoff of the idea that you brought up, that beliefs come in degrees. You can be 51-49, 60-40, 80-20. And that is this, that believing something or even knowing it is consistent with having doubts, unanswered questions, and not being completely 100% certain. Because knowledge and belief, neither one, require us to be completely 100% certain about something. And so I would say if a person's listening and has doubts, God bless you. You join the family and listen to things like this. But I will tell you what I did when I was younger is I doggedly wrote them down on paper, and I committed to finding an answer that satisfied me. And so I listened to tapes and talks and read books. Now we watch shows like this and keep exploring. And there's answers out there, but you'll have to search for them.
That's a great response. You remember when I was at Biola, I think I was a sophomore, and I had a pretty significant doubting period. You told me to do that. You said write them down and one by one find answers to the few that trouble you the most. And that was just wonderful advice. I hope our viewers will take into consideration. Next week, we're actually having Preston Sprinkle on to come talk about the issue of transgender. He has a new book coming out, and he argues that when it comes to certain individuals who are intersex, they have certain combinations of both genders inherent within them. It's not a third gender, and it's not non-gender. There's a combination away that sometimes we just can't fully discern physically or spiritually. That's just the reality. But that doesn't take away from the reality that there are two biological sexes as a whole. So those of you those of you watching that want to unpack this more, we're gonna do that next week. All right, question from Dave Dice. He says, I have a friend who uses arguments for the soul in regard to reincarnation. How would you respond to someone arguing for reincarnation?
Well, let's bring up two different kinds of reincarnation. The first kind, which is really the one that just about everybody holds to this, is that I can come back as another species. I could come back as an animal or any other kind of species. Now, if that's true, what that means is that I am not essentially a human being, a human person. Mm-hmm. In fact, I'm not essentially anything. Because if I could be a human or a dog or any living thing, I don't have an essence or a nature of my own. And if that's the case, I'd like to know what kind of a thing is it that is capable of being reincarnated in a completely different natural kind. And I'm still kind of waiting for an answer to that. It turns out that this thing is some sort of propertyless kind of little monad or little dot, kind of metaphysical this or dot. And I find that I find myself to be essentially a human being. There are a lot of attributes I could lose, my weight, my skin color, my height. But if I became a pillar of salt or a goldfish or an ice cube, my wife would say, that is not JP in a new form. The old guy's out of here, and he got replaced with something. So that's the first kind. The second kind is if a person holds the kind of more of a westernized reincarnation, where you get to come back as you, a human being, but you lived in a previous era as a human. The evidence for that is what I think can be explained. The burden of proof is on people to show that that's true. Because, I think initially it seems just on the surface of it that this is pretty implausible, but you might say I'm willing to hear your case. But if you don't make the case, my default position is I'm not going to buy this unless you override my doubt on it. Well, evidence typically turns out to be things like memories of certain things. The problem is that we know through deja vu and other kinds of experiences that people can have memories of having done something before when they didn't. And so it is very easy to explain these as false memories. So you've got two hypotheses. I really did live in the 1500s at Martin Luther. And served him for a couple of months. Or I have, perhaps because of a whole host of psychological and neurological factors, I have false memories of that maybe play a role in my life that I don't know, maybe helps me feel good about myself. I would opt for that explanation rather than the other one, admitting that the other one is possibly true. But, it's possible the world is 5 seconds old and we all have memories. It doesn't make it even likely. So that's I don't think it's likely given those two explanations.
That's great and really helpful. You'll probably recognize the name Matt Stover. He says, JP, great to see you. I'm still a Christian, largely thanks to conversations in your office 10 to 11 years ago.
Oh, my God. Matt, you're the man, dude. I still haven't gotten a box of chocolates yet, Mr. Stover.
Well, and this is just a hint of how, send the chocolates, how influential your teaching has been. And I mention that because I want to encourage you, because you're not professor emeritus, distinguished professor. We want you around as long as we can have you.
Thank you.
Also those viewing, we really want to take this time to invite you to consider studying with us at Biola, either the Masters of Philosophy program with JP, William Lane Craig, or Apologetics with me. And both of these, we have distance programs. So if you ever thought about getting a master's and want to learn more and become a resource to your church, really think about studying with us. Now, Matt asks, what is the best resource you'd share, a contemporary account of miracles? Now, what I would say, Matt, is I'd say Craig Keener's 2-volume academic set just called Miracles. is the most carefully attested. Quickly, would you add any source to that, JP?
That would be my first choice. The second would be Lee Strobel's book, A Case for Miracles.
Great.
And a year from now, I'll have a book coming out with Zondervan that really is on this very subject. It has a set of 5 different kinds of documented miracles. That's going to be, it's just going to be exciting. But that's going to be out a while. So,
well, for having you on right now and giving you a plug, we'll assume that you'll give us the first interview back here on this channel. So thanks in advance for that, JP.
You're welcome.
All right, we got about 10 minutes left, but here's a great question from Corey Webb. He says, Dr. Moreland, can you talk about your response to arguments about the hiddenness of God? How do you answer those who say, I would happily believe if God would just make himself more obvious?
I would say, number one, well, what's your problem? Because God is obvious to most people. What happened to you? So I would not accept that claim and let it go unchallenged. I would start by saying, well, what happened to you? Because overwhelmingly, 99.9% of the people who've ever lived all over the world have looked at creation and so on, and it's obvious to them that there's a God of some kind. I admit to you that the precise shape of their views can be distorted by their culture. But I believe that they start off being monotheistic in some sense. And it's obvious. I mean, my wife, my parents, it was obvious that God existed to them. I think the second thing that I would say is that if a person really needs more evidence, that God will get it to them. He will get it to them. I was in a situation where I came to Christ, and I was kind of trained to doubt things because of what I majored in college, and I just needed help. And your dad came to campus and gave a talk in the resurrection, and it just blew me away. And I started reading books that gave evidence, and it strengthened me to where I don't have any of those doubts anymore. And so if you need more evidence, ask God for it. Ask him, then search for it and see if you can find it. The other thing I would say would be that God does not coerce. We all know that. To me, love, if it's forced, it's not really love. A person can love somebody only if they genuinely choose to do that, not because somebody put a gun to their head. Now, if God's going to woo us, then he can't overwhelm us on the one hand, but he's got to make himself obvious to anybody who wants to know him. So I think that God is, quote, not obvious to a lot of people who really don't want the world to be a place where there is a cosmic authority.
Wow. That's a powerful response. For those of you watching who say, I want more evidence, JP's book, Scaling the Secular City, is really a classic book to get. Walks through evidence for the Bible, historical Jesus, the arguments for the existence of God. That's a must-read for any apologist or really any skeptic who wants to engage these ideas. Check out Scaling the Secular City. JP, here's one all the way from Indonesia, from Benaya, and I apologize if I mispronounce that. He says, I'm asking a personal question. Does God speak to you now like you had experiences that you had shared publicly many years ago? Warm regards and peace of Christ from Indonesia.
Well, thank you so much for your question. And I will share. There are several stories that are in the book about that. But yes, God has spoken to me. I have never heard his voice audibly. But I know people who have heard the audible voice of God. They actually heard a sound created. But I have heard God's voice very specifically, either through prophetic words or words of knowledge that were given to me by a credible person who knew nothing of the situation I was going through, and they gave details that could not have been known by anybody but God. Now, you got to be wise about these things, but when that happens, then and if it meets the need, that's pretty clear. Yes, I have had those, and I've had times recently when God spoke to me about there being a demon-possessed woman who'd come to a church service that morning where I was speaking, and she came to commit suicide later that day.
Wow.
And she was up in a certain quadrant of the church, and I was to cast the demon out of her. And I got up to preach, about 750 people. I said, I believe there is someone in this section up here, about 130 people there, and someone has come. You're going to take your life later today. You don't go to this church. And the Lord wants you to know that he still has a plan for you, and that I want to cast a demon out of you. And so I spoke in the name of Jesus and cast the demon out. And I found out 2 months later that that woman went to the senior pastor and said I was the guy he was talking about. Everything he said was true. And I've been coming to this church ever since that happened, and my life has been changed. And that was the time God spoke to me before I was getting up to preach. And I went of age, and I was set. By the way, sometimes God speaks and you're 70-30, that it was God, or 60-40. So you don't have to be certain it was God to have good reason to think it was God. A lot of passages, I believe a certain interpretation, but I'm only 60-40 because there are other ones that look good, but I just think this one's better. But I'm not 100% sure this is the right interpretation.
So just because there's some times where you're not sure, it seems like we're back to the question of near-death experiences. On those cases where you had information you could not have known otherwise, it matched up so precisely. Right. That's when you're about as 100% confident as you could be.
Yeah, there's just no other explanation. Yes.
Okay. I do notice in the chat room, Susan Gaines, if you're still watching, seeing you just brings warmth to my heart. Your husband, Dennis, had such a commitment to me personally, playing basketball 2 decades ago at Biola. And thanks for joining us. Please give my love to Daniel, and I really, really hope and trust that you're doing well. JP, we have time, maybe 1 or 2 more. I want to make sure we respect your time, and there's a lot more questions, so we'll have to have you back. But Colt Correa said, I skipped his question at the beginning. I'm sorry, I missed it. He says, according to Francis Collins, quote, evolution and common descent is as established as gravity. He says, Dr. William Lane Craig has agonized over Genesis versus science. What are your thoughts on whether science and Genesis can be reconciled together?
Well, I think that Francis Collins has given up too much real estate without needing to do so. And I believe that it's reasonable to go against the majority opinion of experts in a field if certain conditions are present. Number one, I can explain why the overwhelming number of artists or biologists or whatever hold that view because of theological reasons or the way they're socialized into that field rather than rational reasons. Secondly, if there's a small rebel group of highly trained, skilled PhDs that are publishing in standard venues and are recognized as credentialed, who hold the opposite view, then I have good reason to go against the majority, and I think that's where we stand with evolution. You have to define it. If you mean the blind watchmaker thesis, I don't think there's any good evidence for it, that these things all happen by purely natural processes. I could go into that, but if you mean the thesis of common descent, I think there's some evidence for that. But I do think that there are other ways of explaining the patterns that we see by the employment of a common design plan for organisms that are facing similar environmental tasks. Why reinvent the wheel? And this would explain what I think are called homologous organisms, I believe is the word, that according to evolution evolved parallelly but have the same structures. So it wasn't a borrowing thing, but they both have structures that function kind of similarly for them. So I think that even if, I think that we do not have to at this point accept the general theory of evolution and add to it theistic evolution. I think that there's plenty of evidence that will allow us to be reasonable and still hold out. And so that's kind of where I'm at. Bill Craig ends up believing in a literal Adam and Eve, and he believes that the science is consistent with that, though there is a problem with the dating of when Adam and Eve came about. And I admit there are problems, but look, I'll close with this. I don't know of a single theory in any discipline at the university that doesn't have a few anomalies or problems that count against it. So what? That means that we got to work on it. Now, if we're taking on water over time, then maybe we want to rethink. But I believe things are getting better as time goes on, not worse.
That's a great answer. For those who are interested, you have contributed to a massive volume called Theistic Evolution that looks biblically, theologically, or biblically, scientifically, and philosophically, and offers a pretty powerful critique. Now, there's response to that online, but those of you who want to know what JP thinks, go pick up that book, read it through, read the responses, the counter responses, and that's how you enter into the conversation and see what you think is most reasonable. Now, there's a ton more questions. Susan Slam RN, I am so sorry I missed your question. You faithfully tune in, and I apologize, but I really have to honor Dr. Moreland's time. A couple quick things. Number one, those of you interested in the evolution and theistic evolution question, I had Dr. Swamara on, one of the leading Christians who embraces evolution, and Doug Axe, who also teaches with us at Biola, one of the leading thinkers in the intelligent design movement, 4 or 6 weeks ago, and we unpacked this, and it was a great conversation. One of my favorites that we had that really brought a lot of clarity to both sides. So if you scroll through the videos, you'll find that, and whichever side you're on, I think you'll find it's a cordial conversation with substance, but we also really make some progress and clarity between the different views. JP, last question. Why we have a lot of people who are clearly following apologetics here. Why should they think about studying with you and me at Biola?
Well, it's always good to have a mentor that's been down the road further. So you could pick up health books and you could learn a lot about health on your own, but if you had a physician or somebody guiding you in your reading and being able to handle questions as you read, it's just a lot better to have a mentor that can, under which you can study, a live mentor, and that's why.
That's a great answer, and I would say in my own life, you've been that mentor along with people like William Lane Craig, Greg Kokel, my father, and the older I get, the more grateful I am for that advice. So those of you watching, I can tell you're asking questions about abstract objects, evolution, near-death experiences. Some of you have been at Biola. If not, think about studying with us, because this is exactly the kind of issues we unpack and explore. And our vision is we want to equip you to just minister to your church, your community, and the ministry that God has called you to. So there's information below in the description. Also, if you're like, I'm not ready for a master's, we have a certificate program, which will send you specific lectures, just basic assignments, just to kind of keep you accountable. So you can go to your church and say, hey, I have a certificate. I've really studied this. There's a discount code also below. Coming up, we have some interviews with my father. We did one on some of his untold stories of his life. In a couple weeks, he's coming back on and going to talk about the people who influenced him just to become the person that he is. Because one of the things he said in interviews, everything we've learned is from other people. So he's coming on next week. We have Preston Sprinkle coming on to talk about transgenderism. So make sure you hit that subscribe button, because there's some interviews and videos you will not want to miss. Thanks so much for joining us, Dr. Moreland. So grateful for you, for your ministry. Love calling you a colleague. And thanks for spending your time with us this evening.
My privilege.